Before the scramble for Africa began, European colonies and trading centers covered about a tenth of the continent. The largest European colony in Africa was Algeria, which the French invaded in 1830, leading to a long, bitter, and quite bloody conquest. The Ottomans nominally controlled Libya. The French also had posts and held some territory in Senegal going back to 1659. They began expanding there in the 1830s. Napoleon invaded and conquered Egypt in 1798, but left for France, abandoning his army. The French army surrendered to the British and the Turks in 1801. Africa was affected by events outside the continent long before the scramble for Africa began. The slave trades were by far the most damaging. The 1,000 years of the trans-Saharan slave trade is estimated to have involved 7.2 million slaves. The Red Sea slave trade, 2.4 million. The East African slave trade to India and the Persian Gulf, 2.9 million. And the 400 years of the Atlantic slave trade, some 11.3 million. The number of deaths involved in capturing and transporting the captives is not knowable, but must have been in the millions. A more benign but extremely important connection with events outside Africa was the Columbian Exchange, an exchange of animals and crops between the Old World and the New. Several New World crops became a vital part of African agriculture, greatly increasing its yield and eventually leading to a large spike in the population. Among the American crops adopted in parts of Africa were cassava, corn, known as maize in much of Europe, sweet potatoes, peanuts, commonly called groundnuts in English-speaking Africa, several kinds of beans, chili peppers, cocoa to make chocolate, gourds, pineapples, and several kinds of fruit. Particularly important was the eventual replacement of millet and sorghum, previous staple crops, with maize and cassava. African geography is important in understanding the events of the scramble. The zone along the Mediterranean Sea is much like parts of Spain and Portugal. Below the coast is the vast Sahara Desert, the largest desert in the world, which runs from the Atlantic coast to Egypt and the Red Sea. South of the Sahara and overlapping with it is the Sahel Zone, a sandy semi-desert. South of that is the Sudan, not to be confused with a country called Sudan. A savanna zone that also runs from the Atlantic to the Red Sea. Below Sudan are jungles and rainforests extending deep into the interior, although not across the continent. The Sahara had a small population of nomadic tribes, punctuated by oasis towns. The Sahel and Sudan were more populated and the heartland of several Muslim empires, some very large. The climate allowed horses, so cavalry was an important military aspect that did not exist further south. These peoples were often militarily formidable. The rainforest zones had a considerably larger population and many small chiefdoms. The diseases carried by the tsetse fly prevented horses, camels, and livestock, so there were no nomadic cattle herders or carts, wagons, pack animals, or animal-drawn plows. South Africa had a milder climate, and East Africa had sizable upland areas and the African Great Lakes. The division between Muslim and Arab peoples were generally along the southern border of the Sudan. South of it lays what the European explorers often called Black Africa, populated by the many Bantu and other peoples. These were agricultural peoples with tremendous cultural variety, and many tribes were warlike. In East and South Africa, the tsetse fly did not exist, and cattle herding was a way of life for many people groups. Many areas were involved in trade. Trade had long connected much of Africa to Europe and parts of Asia. An ancient route went from West Africa to the Mediterranean with ivory, gold, and slaves going north, and salt, textiles, iron, gems, and other items going south. Trade from some of East Africa went up the Nile and across the Red Sea, again involving ivory, slaves, textiles, and iron. Africa had little available iron, and African blacksmiths were avid to obtain it through trade. The East African coast, consisting of a Muslim and partly Arab culture called Swahili, developed trade with India and the Persian Gulf. This trade link also involved ivory, gold, and slaves.